I am not going to talk about uncommon cures today. I'm going to talk about rare disease. First off, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see a lot of very familiar faces out here. I've decided a long time ago there are about 6 people in the rare disease world. If you hang around long enough, you meet them again and again. I'll be getting pointers for those of you in the corporate world later on, so I don't make a complete fool of myself. This is our new campus. It's a research and innovation campus. It's in the United States Army from the old Walter Reed site. We've got 12 acres of land. We have a clinic there for rare disease patients and a huge research facility for them as well, too. But the most important thing in DC, a 1,200 space parking garage. So, the thesis I've been developing over the last few years is that rare disease is starting to emerge as a unique field of medicine. Now, what do I mean? These are conditions that have some differences from mainstream medicine. First off, they're lifetime in nature. They're typically genetic. They may not manifest in the newborn period, but the genes are there, the findings are there, and they're there for the patient's lifetime, although some of you all are making some efforts to fix that. The evidence is based on very small numbers of patients. I heard one of the questions from the last session about how do we make sure that the data from these few patients is available to be multi-purposed, and it's something we really do have to focus on. There's limited incidence data. You want to ask, how often is this disease? There's usually zeros in the answer, which means we kind of guessed. There's limited outcome data. Also, there's genetic heterogeneity, so I'll have the same disease present in a newborn or in a 90-year-old, depending on their genetic change in that particular system. So big variations in the group. Patients and families are really our best sources of information. They always have been, and I think that will continue. While we can pull data from different records, these patients are so sparse and rare that we really do have to work with our patients and families. And if we don't, we're really missing the boat. Care expertise is limited. There are not that many people in the field. It's growing, but still, I'll show you a little bit of information about that later on. How you define rare disease, location matters. US, we use the FDA definition of under 200,000 in the population, which works out to about 1 in 1,600. In Europe, they use 1 in 2,000, nice round number. Taiwan and Japan use a 1 in 10,000, but have a limited list. Western Australia uses 1 in 2,000. So when you're talking about rare, depending on who you're talking to, the actual official definitions do change. A good working definition is probably around 2 to 5% of the US population, or about 16 million Americans. In Europe, that's about 22 million Europeans. So not an insignificant group. Why so many? Well, think about any survey you do. If you have an open label for one of your answers, usually you got more answers there than you do for the ones you preset. So think of rare disease as that other category where there are so many different things going on in there. Sort of the definition I like, it's a disease that's uncommon enough where a general practitioner would not be that familiar with or know how to treat necessarily without diving into some resources, and that's also something we got to fix. So what has the growth been like? So we currently have recognized about 6,900 diseases. We've described about 9,000 clinical phenotypes so far that we haven't got the genes for yet, so it's growing all the time. Most of this growth has happened since 2000 when we finished the draft of the human genome. If you do the math, that works out to 10 to 12 new diseases a week that are described. It's not that these are new occurring diseases, it's just we can identify them now. There's no other field of medicine that's like that, where you have this kind of growth. So by doing this lecture this afternoon, I have missed a disease, so I got to go back and catch up on it later tonight. But think about the classic physician model is you're supposed to be a master of everything in your field. You go to a gastroenterologist, you expect them to know, or particularly a liver specialist. They should know all the diseases there. I can honestly look at my patients and say, I do not know all the potential diseases this could be. We are more dependent on information technology than any other field of medicine. And that's not going to change. That is going to continue. In fact, it's accelerating. I'll show you some of the stuff. We have treatments for around 600 of these conditions. Now, what's happening with survival? It's going up. Down syndrome, which is a borderline rare disease, had an average life expectancy in the mid-20s in the 1980s. It's approaching 60 now. Cystic fibrosis, we don't know what the back end is because it goes up every year because the patients are surviving. Sickle cell anemia, same thing, but this is a trend we're seeing across multiple diseases. And for those of you who develop therapies out there, you have been a big contributor to this. So not only are we recognizing more diseases, we now have patient populations that are surviving longer and longer. So while this has classically been a pediatric field, it is now a lifespan field. And that's another thing. We don't have a lot of adult trained physicians who know how to deal with these patients. Now, another thing to think about is the breakdown of common diseases into smaller and smaller subgroups. As we apply molecular and genetic diagnostics, think about breast cancer. Most folks would call that a common disease. It actually breaks down into 30 different molecular subtypes, which given each one are the size of rare disease groups. So the lessons we're learning in treatment, funding, and everything else around rare disease are actually starting to apply more and more to mainstream medicine. So the things we develop eventually, I think, will roll out more and more to the general population. So let's talk a little bit about the economics of rare disease, and I'll talk about a couple of things. So what's it cost to treat a rare disease patient? It varies from year to year, but it's normally about 8 to 9 times that of a common or more mainstream disease. But it typically runs about $80,000 to $90,000 a year. That's not counting medicines, that's counting care, therapy, hospitalizations, take your pick, but that's about what it averages out to. The therapies we have, we've now got a whole bucket list that grows. This is another thing that by doing this talk I'm already behind on. There's probably a new therapy that's been developed while we're out there. Organ transplants, enzymes, small molecules, even dietary therapy, where you're starting to play with the gut microbiome to use for treat for rare disease. There's so many different things you can do and you can look at. Do these therapies have an impact? If you look at a couple of diseases like Gaucher, cystic fibrosis, hemophilia, significant increases in survivability of patients before and after there was an approved therapy. So these approved therapies do make a difference. Spinal muscular atrophy, great example. I used to sit with my patients and counsel them about how their child was going to die. Now I watch the kids run down the hallway. It's kind of mind-boggling the difference we see with some of these things. Won't be true for all of them, but enough where it's really been worthwhile. If you read that necklace, that's from one of my patients. I'll read it to you. God gives us only what we can handle. Apparently, God thinks I'm a badass. I just had to put that in the lecture. All right, so I work with the FDA on a fairly regular basis. If there's any FDA folks here, hi. And we dove through the latest data, and there have been 1,078 orphan drug approvals since 1983 with the passage of the Orphan Drug Act. That's 497 unique drugs, but remember, some of them will have multiple indications, and in some rare diseases, there are multiple categories for that. So about half of them are for cancer. The rest are for the sort of giant grab bag of rare diseases that we deal with. And as you can see, over the last 3 years, or 4 years, that number's actually accelerated. So most of the published data out there is from 2017 or 2020, so this is actually up to date from their most recent data. There have been over 6,000 orphan drug designations since 1983, 2,300 in the last couple of years. So the number of designations has been steadily going up and going up. The number of approved new chemical or new medical entities by the FDA, it's 52% over the last 5 years of the drugs approved. Now, by number of patients impacted, that's very different. You know, the ones for more common conditions obviously are hitting a larger, but of the new entities coming through, it's 52%, which is a staggering number, and that number is increasing, which is why we have to pay attention to it. When I started in the field in 1985, there was really no therapies then, but as we started to pick up a few, the payers were like, yes, it's expensive, but you know, there's not that many of them, it's just a few patients, okay, we'll eat it. But now, we're approaching 15 to 20% of the world drug market in rare disease. that is a noticeable impact. And even if it's only 10% when we take cancer out of the picture, that is still a noticeable impact. So we have to do a better job of getting the costs down of developing some of these new therapies. So one reason it's been so attractive, besides the incentives in the Orphan Drug Act, is the rates of success in clinical trials in rare disease. The average for most drugs coming through is about 9 to 10%. It's 25 to 26% rate of success for an orphan designation drug coming through. Usually that's because the effect size is so much greater. Many of these diseases are life and death diseases, so the treatments are very much easier to spot an effect size, plus some of the things that go through into the trial. So that's one reason it's so attractive, besides all of the incentives from orphan drug. I did an anonymous survey of 10 CEOs of orphan companies. I don't think, well, one or two of you might be here, I don't know. Phase 1 averaged about 5 million. Phase 2 averaged about 48 million. Phase 3 averaged about 365 million. And Phase 4 averaged about 94 million. That's $511 million on average to run an orphan drug through the pipeline. And these were non-cancer drugs, so I kind of limited them to that. That's about 50%, depends on which data you use, of a mainstream drug to come through the pipeline. So we can do better on that. That's one of the things we've got to figure out how to improve. So one of the reasons it costs so much is you've got about half the patients typically in an orphan drug study, but it takes about twice the time to complete. The average gap time between approval for one and approval for the other is about 6 to 7 years. So orphan drugs take about 7 years longer to run through the approval process. They'll typically take about a decade to run through, and everyone thinks they can do it faster, and sometimes you can, but typically not. Now, if I go to my children's hospital, so I pulled data on 1.5 million visits, and we ran through with all of our ICD-10 rare disease codes to see what we might find. If you go one time to a children's hospital, you got a 12% chance of having a rare disease. If you get admitted to the hospital, it's almost 20%. If you go to a children's hospital more than once, then it's about 30% chance you have a rare disease. So these are hugely impactful on pediatric hospitals. Great study out of Rainbow Babies up in Cleveland showed that about 50 to 55% of their hospital charges were for patients with known genetic diagnoses. So the point there is these are patients who are high consumers of resource across the board, whether it's hospital-based, outpatient, everything else. So this is something we have to pay attention to as well, too. What's our workforce look like in genetics? Not great. There's probably about 560 practicing geneticists in the United States. The therapies tend to cluster around biochemical genetic disorders. There's about 75 to 80 practicing biochemical geneticists in the United States. So whenever I meet someone from industry, I say, dear God, please do not recruit another one of my colleagues to go become your chief medical officer. I actually had to physically threaten one company, and they finally let off. But we've got about 1 per 250,000 in the United States, which means one of two things. One, let's try to catch up. We're not going to catch up with the need for physicians in this. It means we have to do things differently. And medicine, in spite of the fact that we like to think we're all cutting edge and everything, my bank has much more sophisticated informatics than my electronic medical record. The fact that we can't run a longitudinal natural history study in an EMR currently is sad. But we've kind of got one foot on the dock and one foot on the boat. The foot on the dock are the things that still pay so you can keep your hospital open. The foot on the boat are some of the things we actually need to do to face the realities of what's going on clinically. So how do we start to navigate these things? To me, it's all problems are things just to work on. Collaboration, obviously, new care models. Technology is absolutely a must. I already told you, without digital, our field dies. We have to have digital. And we have to involve frontline care providers. If we do not do that, and we don't do it in a smart and thoughtful way, our patients will not get care. So we've been doing a lot of things. We developed the NORD Centers of Excellence, and thank you for the plug for that, but there's actually now 31 of them across the United States. We worked pretty hard on rolling out that program. NORD did a great job with that. We have a World Health Organization collaborative network to look at what are realistic ways to bring rare disease to the world. There's a global commission. If there's anyone from Takeda, y'all been one of the sponsors along with Microsoft to shorten the time for diagnostics. There's the International Rare Disease Research Consortium, or IRDIC, which is the world's worst acronym, and more. But you can actually map these processes out. I was at Virginia Tech recently, and I was able to meet with a couple of their process engineers. And one of the things we're talking about is, if you take that medical journey, can you actually break it down into processes and work on engineering it to do a better job? And the answer is yes, you can. There's a lot of things you can do. So we've actually been working on that. We've got projects going on at almost every step of the process. Others do too. This isn't just my center. This is lots of centers working together on this. That little loop in the middle is what we call the diagnostic washing machine, which is where, you know, someone has a bright idea. Did anyone watch the show House? I hate that show. If I treated my patients that way, they'd either all be dead or I'd be in prison, or both. The idea is someone has a bright idea, you run off and test it, and you know, the fact that they had interns doing some of the tests they were doing was just wrong. And then if that's wrong, you come back and do it again. What we actually have to do is push back, pick our most broad-based diagnostics, apply them at the appropriate early point in the process, like newborn screening, like other places, so that we can actually preempt that whole journey, which can take years. I had one patient who was on a 50-year diagnostic odyssey. Some of it was just the technology wasn't available until they were about 50 years old. Telemed has been one of the things I've been working on for years, my group's been working on for years. We had actually built out the infrastructure, and then we got to run the big experiment in 2020. So we were doing about 50 to 60 telemed visits a month. Then we suddenly were doing 700 to 800. But we were able to flip in 24 hours, which was nice. So all of our patients, actually our admission rates went down by 25% using telemedicine during the worst parts of COVID. So not having, well, if you've got a medically fragile patient, where's the last place you want to take them? A pediatric emergency room. I mean, that's like, let's go walk you through the germs. But there's a bunch of things we found with that we suspected, but we actually got to prove. One was access. If you are a single parent and you are working, taking a day off to come into a medical center to get evaluated, it may not be an option. But we had families that could go by their child's school, take them out to the car, we'd do the telemedicine visit there. The kid didn't miss any school, the parent was able to get back to work, or we do it right after they got off from work. So our access improved, not only from a logistics standpoint for the families, but also geographically. Those electrons are real fast. So as long as the licensure issues, which is a whole nother thing we got to work on nationally, but we can actually get to patients that before had no access. Virtual home visit. If you've ever dealt with patients with autism, if you bring them into a hospital environment, they will often, they lose it. And they will become destructive, they may hit, and you get no idea of what that patient looks like. What we found on the telemedicine visits is we could see these children at home. I had one mom, she actually was crying. She had two boys, they're both in their 20s. She said, if I had them with you, they'd be tearing the room apart and you'd have to call security. Instead, I got to meet two nice young men who were sitting there quietly. They definitely had some medical issues, but I actually got to see them as they were, not as they would be in that other environment. So we actually saw some improvements in the visits we had. Now, is it a 100% solution? No, but it's better than nothing. It also removed barriers. We were able to reduce the cycle time to make decisions about patients because we could set up a quick telemed call. For families we had where one of the parents was deployed overseas, we had a couple of visits where we had a parent in Afghanistan who was on duty there who could actually participate in their child's visit in real time while we were seeing them. And those are some special moments. The other thing is it's easier to pull specialists together. Multidisciplinary clinics for these complex diseases are pretty common, But if you pull 5 medical specialists together and one patient doesn't show, you wasted about 5 hours or 5 visits for those patients, for those docs. If you actually can do it by telemed, you can actually make it more efficient. Also, the no-show rates go way down. Average no-show rates in most pediatric clinics are about 15 to 20%. Ours went down to about 4 to 5. We already talked about that. The other one is, how do we get our frontline docs in doing? So we have to make clinical protocols that are useful at the front line. So what we call scenario-based protocols. If any of you know the REDCap system that Vanderbilt University developed for the CTSAs, we're actually partnering with them. I was on their old development team years ago, and we have a program called RareCap. These are, think of it as Wikipedia meets Reddit. So these are protocols designed around practical scenarios for rare disease patients that then the user community, so the registered users, can actually make comments on saying this worked, this didn't work, because the published literature lags 10 to 15 years behind your need to be able to treat patients. So by crowdsourcing a lot of this, getting the comment from the community, incorporating those that the community agrees, actually we can improve these protocols quite quickly and build on them that. So that will be rolling out this fall. That was, we had a lovely donation to put this program together. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And hopefully we'll help standardize our care more too. Every time we've standardized care in one of our rare disease fields, patients do better. Whether it's cystic fibrosis, sickle cell, urea cycle disorders, take your pick. And then finally, what do you do in areas where there's just nothing? Well, we go run a clinic in Uganda every year or so with cardiac surgeons, and we'll typically see about 200 to 300 patients during a week. Of those, we'll find at least 5 to 10 patients who have Down syndrome, something everybody recognizes, who've never been diagnosed, who are often teenagers. The thing is, there are cheap things you can do available in those medical systems that would help those patients. But to do a chromosome study would be about the clinic budget for the month. So how do you do that? Well, the one thing we found is wherever you go, somebody's got a smartphone. Doesn't matter. The Wi-Fi service seems to be one of the most universally equitable developments in my lifetime anyway. And so we built a back-end piece of evaluation facial recognition software that is about 98% accurate for diagnosing Down syndrome. Gives a U-shaped probability curve. You're either highly likely to have it or not. In the US, we'd go back and confirm that. There, though, it's good enough to actually move ahead with treatment. So we've been making that available. We've been working with some international partners. We actually had some of it published in The Economist, of all places, which I never expected to be. But that's another thing you can do. We have to leverage technology to do these things. So for me, the glass is neither half empty nor half full. It's always got something in it, whether it's air or water. And the job is to just kind of keep filling it up. So with that, I finished 1 minute early. All right. Do we do questions, or do you need to move on to your next? Oh, moderators of time. Okay. I know I wasn't that clear. That or it's after lunch. All right. Yes.
My big question is always about whether or not it's a comprehensive care model for rare disease, akin to what they've done in the hemophilia community, cancer, et cetera. So that's, I don't know much about what that would look like, but as a patient.
What they look like is the key element in care teams around rare disease is actually navigation. And so we spend a lot of time and effort getting people who can walk families through. So I ended up in a strange series of things working with the Black Women's Health Imperative on rare disease and equity issues about both research and treatment-wise. And one of the things we found that families struggled with, and this is across the board, is if you're a new parent particularly and you're suddenly confronted with this monolithic medical system, it's hard to navigate. And it's really hard I can make the most brilliant diagnosis from, actually I wouldn't, one of my docs would. But if that family can't get to those services, can't execute on that plan with all the other things going on in their life, it doesn't do them no good. So we're actually focused as much on navigation as we do anything. That's up to y'all. And the next panel, which isn't glaring at me too much yet.
Hi, Dr. Summar. Betsy Ricketts from Ultragenics. Thanks so much for being here. As you mentioned, we did have friends from the FDA here earlier and sharing with us, over 1,000 designations have been made in the last few years. And of course, the approvals are a quarter of that. We continue to see the challenge with FDA reviewers not knowing the complexities of the disease. And as you very clearly stated, it costs us time and money.
Oh, yeah.
And most certainly with patients' time. Would love to hear your thoughts about a proposal that Dr. Aeglea had offered up a few years ago of perhaps doing an NIH partnership with FDA of borrowing the really smart minds, recruiting your team, perhaps not for a short amount of time, and then having them go back. Also addressing the time frame FDA is having a hard time hiring.
Yeah. So that's a broad question. Let me try to give you a succinct answer. The FDA, right now, the biggest lockups I'm seeing tend to be around the statisticians. Actually, a couple of the docs in the orphan group there were my former docs who I trained. So you've now actually got some folks at FDA who really know the rare disease field and know it quite well. I also sit on council at NCATS, which is the NIH group that handles clinical and translational science. We actually already have a pilot program in place where we have NIH folks going to FDA and FDA folks now coming to NIH. Why on earth would we fund a clinical trial in rare disease if the data wouldn't be acceptable eventually for an FDA type approval? It's a waste of money and time and effort and everything else. So these are some efforts going forward. The reverse of NIH folks going to FDA has not been as robust. I know Janet definitely has been a fan of it and the other folks in the orphan section there. The interesting thing is that the NIH, they don't necessarily have as much deep expertise in clinical trials. So it's almost like that 7th grade high school dance where you've got them each lined up on the other side of the room and you say, you're supposed to get together here, and you just kind of got to kick them out into the middle. So there's a bunch of us on council at NCATS that are working on kind of shoving folks out in the middle, but no, I agree. And it's been a good concept for a while. I know Chris Austin spent a lot of time working on it. Joni Rutter, who's currently the director at NCATS, definitely believes in that as well too. And I can tell you the folks on council are pushing hard for it. You're welcome. All righty then.